Okay, so I have been traveling for the past week. It's just been a really chaotic week for me. I was in 4 different states, but I'm finally back home. So honestly, I have not been super up to date with what's going on from this past week. So I figured I would actually sit down and make a video about my entire, I guess, transition from being super far left over to being a conservative right. I think it's interesting, and I think there's probably a lot of people that are also going through this move or have gone through this move. And I think that it's probably a lot more common than it seems. And I think the reason for that is, again, something that I've spoken about before, which is the fear mongering coming from people on the left when you live in a really blue state. So I do think there's a lot of people like me that are just not speaking out about it. And although I wish more people would, I don't blame them because my dog's eating. I don't blame them because as human beings and as animals, we've basically learned and evolved in a way where we wanted to best increase our chances of survival. And we found that in most cases, that was by being part of a community and not being shunned. So I think most people just can't get past that innate fear. And I can, I guess, so whatever. But anyways, let's start from the beginning. I grew up in New Jersey with 2 really liberal parents, or they were very, very liberal at the time. My mom is a Korean immigrant who came here when she was about 13 years old, learned English here, worked her ass off, and lived out the American dream. My dad is an American from New Jersey, born and raised there. And when I was really young, my mom actually volunteered on Hillary Clinton's first campaign. And my dad brought me to Obama's first inauguration, which I was so young and had no idea what was going on. All I knew was that it was the most important moment in history. And my dad dragged us out of the house like the night before. So we went all the way from New Jersey down to DC, did not have a hotel booked. Everything was completely full. So we slept in the car and then went to the inauguration. And all I remember is that it was freezing cold, snowing. It was so packed. People were crying, so excited. Beyonce was there. I couldn't see shit, but whatever. So I definitely grew up thinking that being a Democrat and being on the left was the equivalent of having morals, wanting people to be treated equally, being anti-racism, anti-misogyny, all these things. And one other thing to note is that I grew up basically atheist, although I think my dad still had some Christian tendencies, but he was just not very involved. So like I didn't go to church or anything. And like I've mentioned in other videos too, my dad is schizophrenic. He has had a crazy, crazy life, and it's impacted me in tons of different ways. And I think when I was younger, I operated from the place of, well, look at my dad who's been dealt this crazy hand and it's not fair and he's suffering. He can't hold a job. He's in jail, in and out of psych wards, and no one understands. No one cares. I felt very alone and isolated in that experience. And I remember thinking that that was because mental illness had such a stigma around it and people were so judgmental. And if people were more progressive and liberal, then they would care and I could speak openly about it, which I don't believe to be the case now. But at the time, I cared a lot about this, and I looked at my dad as this victim, somebody who didn't deserve the hand that they were dealt. And I felt that he couldn't help himself. It wasn't his fault. I just wanted people to feel bad for him because I felt bad for him. Like, that was the origination of where I fell to the left. And then I moved to New York for college. I've been in New York ever since then. And I remember going to the Ferguson marches in New York City. And at the time, you know, I wasn't the most well-versed in politics, but I was still involved. I was pretty involved for my age, I would say. And I would go to like the Young Democrats Club meetings in New York City. And I went to the marches, and I remember just feeling so moved, and I felt like I operated from a place where it was feelings first, and that it felt like a human experience to put your feelings first and to feel for other people. And so when all of this was going on, I felt very, very affected for the families. I'm not a Black African American, and I want to show support for them if they feel, and for this group of people, if they feel unsafe and discriminated against. And then I was still like very progressive and liberal by the time I graduated college here in New York. And I didn't really think too critically about policies. I think that was really the crux of everything. I felt, okay, I care about other people. I want to help them. If they're saying this, this, and that, then it must be true. Why should I question that? If that's their experience, let's listen to their feelings. Also, in New York, we are truly indoctrinated to believe that the rest of the country hates immigrants, hates minorities, hates women. I remember growing up, like, while I was in college here, I never traveled across America. I was like, America sucks. I don't need to go to the South. They're going to hate me. They're going to be mean to me. It's going to be dangerous. Truly, that was the mentality that I was accustomed to living in New York City. And you know what's so funny is that living in New York City, you think that you're like going to be an outcast when you go to any other state in the country because you're pro-abortion, pro-women's rights, pro-whatever, LGBTQ. But the reality is, if you're outcasted in the rest of the country, it's because you're going to those states with this mentality that all these people hate you. You're paranoid. You also make way more money than everyone else in the country. And you are, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I realized that also when my mom, my stepdad moved down to Florida, and I started going to Florida a lot more. I started going to other places in the US, and I realized nobody's treating me any differently. In fact, they care less. And I just think that it's really terrible. It's toxic how in New York City, and probably in LA and San Francisco as well, we are truly indoctrinated to believe that everyone is out to get us. Like, we're truly breeding paranoia. I kind of left college just feeling the same way. You know, I didn't think that much of it. Really, the major shift in my thinking started around COVID, and I think that's probably a case for a lot of people. So I was living here in New York City throughout COVID, and it was a mess, right? And I had a group of friends from college. Almost all of them are super, super liberal. Some of them are self-proclaimed socialists. And I have mentioned some of them in past videos and how they actually harbor like clear racist tendencies. But that's besides the point. I had this group of friends, and every group of friends has different dynamics and there's different relationships amongst individuals in those groups. And I had a friend that was kind of like on the outskirts of this group that I was closest with, and maybe they weren't as close with the rest of the group. And one of our other friends was getting engaged during COVID. And so we had decided, okay, we're going to have a small engagement party for them. And they requested that all of us just get, a test before we come to show that we don't have COVID. Fine. So we all got a test. And then on the day of this party, my friend on the outskirts of the group waited in line for like 4 or 5 hours outside in the freezing cold, because this was in December of 2020, to get this test. And she finally got the test, texted the group and said like, hey, I got it. It's negative. What's the address? When she sent that message, I was already at the apartment with all these people, and they all looked at each other and they were like, okay, so-and-so got her test and it's negative, but I feel like she shouldn't come anyways because I saw that she was out with other people earlier this week. So like, we don't really know if her test matters. I think I just needed something so glaringly hypocritical to snap something inside of me. And that was definitely the thing that really woke me up, where I realized that this was nothing to do with COVID. And in fact, they were just using this fear, this quote unquote fear of COVID, to manipulate who they surrounded themselves with. They didn't want this person to come, and so they were changing their minds on what the rules were for getting in. And this person had stood outside for 5 hours in the freezing cold. So I made a scene and I left. I was like, I'm not going to associate with this sort of behavior. I'm going to go meet up with that person because that's the right thing to do. Whatever. When all of the dust settled there, I was having conversations with these people. And the more and more that we talked about it, I just started to realize that the way that they were thinking about COVID was extremely short-minded. So a lot of the conversations were about, oh, well, we need to save as many people as we can right now because people are dying. But they just did not acknowledge any long-term effects that we could know at the time would occur from closing down the global economy. And at the time, I wasn't even the most well-versed in international policy, in American policy, but I knew that if you close down the economy, we are going to see extreme levels of unemployment, which can be easily tied to lower life expectancies, etc. But they would just never talk about this. And I thought this was really strange because we were all working from home, and so we all had jobs. But then the people that live in New York City that need to be on site for work were not able to work. And it was really easy to sit at home and say that you were saving lives when you were also still receiving a salary. So this is when I started to really branch away from the rest of the people I knew that were Democrats. I also just started reading things more critically and in an open-minded way. I think the main thing that I used to think of when I thought of progressive was open-mindedness. And I do think that originally that's really what that party stood for. But it became really clear that we were going through a shift where, in fact, to be a progressive, it was to not be open-minded to anything that anyone on the left might be wrong about. So that was the initial crack in the way I was viewing the left and the right. And I do remember the first time Trump got elected, I was so devastated. I wanted Hillary Clinton to win. I didn't really know why. I didn't have any good reason besides the fact that she'd be the first woman president. And, you know, my mom worked for her campaign and it would have been so great. And then who's this guy? I just thought of it as in terms of like, this person's good, this person's bad. Oh, I don't know. I didn't think of it that deeply. And yet I wanted to care about it. And I think that's what a lot of people want to do. Like they want to feel that they're involved and that they're well informed. And that means that they have to have an opinion, when sometimes the best thing to do is to not have an opinion if you're not ready to have one. So anyways, that was COVID. Okay. And I feel like we were just sitting around and you know, for me at least, I knew that the world was crumbling. I knew that things were going to be really bad coming out of COVID. And I felt like I was crazy. Like, how come no one around me is seeing this? How come no one around me is capable of thinking in a long-term vision? Like, if everything was just such instant gratification and everyone was ignoring the fact that this was going to really fuck things up. So that was really like the beginning of the end. You know, once I started to also realize that the people that I was surrounded by were people that couldn't hold an opinion on their own without it being validated by the rest of the group, that's when I really started to think like, you know, these are some people that are really highly educated that I used to think were really smart. And being smart doesn't necessarily mean being brave. And that's kind of the distinction that I was making at the time. And I just decided, you know, I am not like that. I'm brave. You know, I think the same things that drew me to the left growing up with my dad and etc. also made me strong, resilient, and brave. So that actually kind of were the main qualities of like why I was able to start viewing things more objectively. And I also think with age, as you get older, you should be able to get to a place where you don't just act on emotion. You don't just think of feelings first. There's this saying, if you're young and a Republican, you have no heart. If you're old and you're a Democrat, you have no brain. And genuinely, that's truly holds so true, because I think when you're younger, you're not really like responsible for being the most informed. There's so many other things that you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be in school, you're supposed to be playing sports, etc. And so you use feelings and what other people communicate to you about their feelings as a way to act. And then when you get older, I think that you should be learning how to be more responsible with things. And in that same vein, we have to be responsible for our society. And by being responsible for our society, that means that we kind of have to like choose our battles. And I don't think that means that you don't care about other people. I think it means that you actually care about outcomes and processes. And, you know, when I was younger, and I looked at my dad's situation and thought like, oh, the stigma around mental illness is so messed up and people don't care and people are judgmental. That was such a self-centered view of suffering. And once I started to heal and get past that experience too, I started to realize that there's a lot of people that are worse off. And in fact, knowing that actually made me more conservative, because I realized that the Progressive Party was starting to stand for things that were so far out there and so fringe that they were neglecting the larger part of people that were suffering. So if we think about healthcare, and all we see are talking heads on the left talking about transgender healthcare and transgender youth, they're not talking about the millions and millions of people like my dad who are disabled, struggling with mental illness, maybe struggling with physical disabilities, struggling with drug addiction, that are being neglected, because you also need to realize that money is not a bottomless pit. It's a limited resource. And so learning how to like think about things in a larger sense and then also for a long-term result was something that I only started doing once I became more conservative. I think a lot of the issue with the way that people on the left think about conservatives is they think they don't care. Like, that couldn't be farther from the truth about me, at least, where I care a lot, but I also realized, especially living in New York City for the past 13 years, that selecting Democrats has been good for the soul and been good for personal virtues, but has not been good for the people that I supposedly care about. So it's a fallacy. It's like a huge fallacy where the virtue signaling is very, very real. It's very, very potent. If you identify as a Democrat and you identify as like, I'm this democratic socialist, then somehow you care more than anyone else. When in reality, a lot of times making decisions for other people and in their best interest or in the best interest of as many people as possible is going to be something that you need to remove your feelings from, because it's something that's so important cannot be conflated with feelings, especially if they're not necessarily going to be compatible with long-term thinking. That's especially true when we talk about anyone in roles that are extremely high stress or extremely dangerous. So when we talk about people in the army and we talk about generals, they can't make decisions just based off of emotion, because if you want to protect the most amount of people, you can't be thinking tunnel vision where you're only protecting yourself or only protecting one other person, or thinking, oh, this is going to be such a tragedy if this person dies, so I should save them even if it puts 500 other people at risk. When you want to help everyone, you feel good, but it's not possible. So if you try to take a rational approach where you help as many people as possible, and inevitably there's a group of people that maybe aren't being helped, yes, you might not feel amazing, but it's the best result for as many people as possible. Anyways, this is just like a very rambly video. And this video is really just my own personal experience. This is not about anything that's going on lately in the news. So, take it with a grain of salt. This is just my experience. This is my opinion. But yes, if you're young and a Republican, you have no heart. And if you're old and a Democrat, you have no brain. And I've never heard anything more true than that.